Welcome to this session. Everybody has been thanking Bishop Maximus and his staff for this wonderful conference. I think also this would be an opportune time to thank Fordham University's Center for Orthodox Christian Studies, which has had a significant support in this conference as well. So we want to indicate our gratitude to them. We have two speakers this afternoon in this session. Unfortunately, Grigory Benovich could not be with us because of the illness of his wife. So our first speaker for this session is Father Kalinik Berger, who is a priest of the Romanian Orthodox Church, Holy Cross Parish in Hermitage, Pennsylvania. He has graduated from the Catholic University of America with his PhD in theology and a wonderful dissertation on one of the greatest of all modern interpreters of Maximus the Confessor, Father Dumitru Stăniloae. And so Father Berger is going to be sharing his passion for this great interpreter of Maximus with us. So we are delighted to have him speak to us. His title is St. Maximus the Confessor in Contemporary Orthodox Theology, the work of Father Dumitru Stăniloae. Thank
you. Your Eminence, Your Graces, Reverend Fathers, brothers and sisters in Christ, I too would like to thank Bishop Maxim for inviting me and for the organizers for their excellent work. It's been a pleasure, a joy, and a real honor to be here. I just wanted to make one preliminary remark about my talk, and that is, at this conference we've analyzed many different perspectives of St. Maximus, his thought and his writings. And his thought is so broad and so rich and so deep that from whatever perspective we come to it, we're sure to be rewarded. But there's one overarching perspective that I think contextualizes his work. And that was, he was a servant of the church, and he was concerned with a way of life that leads us into a union with Christ. And all of his writings have to do with explicating this and leading us to this way of life. And I think as Orthodox Christians, as Orthodox thinkers and theologians, or any type of Christian, if we want to appropriate his thought, as Father Maximus said, we too have to strive to enter into this way of life and be guided by him. And so therefore we might ask the question, if we did so, how would our contemporary Orthodox theology be shaped? And I think the answer to that question, or one answer to that question, perhaps we have such an example of a living appropriation of St. Maximus in Father Stăniloae. So my preliminary remark is that to understand Father Stăniloae's work in St. Maximus, his primary goal, always, as a servant of the Church, was to lead us into this way of life that the saint is guiding us to. And that is the fundamental paradigm which drove and guided all of his work, which we'll now discuss. Stăniloae's work in the writings of St. Maximus spanned decades, from the 1940s to the 1990s, during which time he translated and published all of the saint's major works: the Mystagogia on the Lord's Prayer, the Ascetic Discourse, chapters on love, the theological and polemical chapters, the questions, doubts, the answers to Thalassius, all between 1941 and 1948. And then later, the complete Ambigua, and finally the epistles and the shorter theological and polemical works in 1983 and 1990. Stăniloae provided these texts with thorough introductions and extensive annotations, some of which have been translated, and which not only present information from modern scholarship, but his own often inspired reflections. This work of translation and annotation, an enormous achievement in itself, had a decisive influence on Stăniloae's own theological thought, in which the thought of the saint is prominent and his writings cited more than any other church father. Such is evident already in his early Christological monograph, Jesus Christ or the Restoration of Man, published in 1943, as it is in all of his later major works, published decades later, his Orthodox Dogmatic Theology, Orthodox Spirituality, his Commentary on the Liturgy, and I list some other works in my paper. Additionally, St. Maximus figures notably in several of his important articles and culminating in a major study, The Christology of St. Maximus the Confessor, published in 1990, just a few years before his death. Certainly, Staniloae's remarkable production and dedication to St. Maximus places him in an elite group of scholars. However, Staniloae's devotion to the Confessor cannot be appreciated nor properly understood outside of the overall goal and context of his own theological work. Father Staniloae was first and foremost a man of the Church. His work was driven by the needs of the Church, and in particular in its efforts to confront the cultural and secular trends of the modern world, and fueled by his own personal quest to know God. Additionally, the centrality he accorded to St. Maximus must be seen in relation to several prior events in Staniloae's life, not the least of which was his discovery of the writings of St. Gregory Palamas and of the Philokalia. First, his own quest. Staniloae was raised in a deeply religious family. Already by the age of 10, he had himself read the entire Bible and wished to become a priest. So perhaps key to his own theological formation was the fact that he dropped out of seminary because he found the theological instruction of his day unsatisfying and divorced from any living experience. However, under the influence of Metropolitan Nicolae Bilan, he returned, finished his licentiate, and was sent abroad for studies in Athens and Germany. So now 3 major events that led him to St. Maximus. First, in Athens, Staniloae discovered the writings of St. Gregory Palamas and recognized in them a patristic theological expression of what he was seeking, a theology of experience. In the writings of St. Gregory Palamas, Staniloae wrote, quote, "I met a God who comes towards man, opens himself to him like light through prayer. He fills him with his energies, yet remains incommunicable, incomprehensible, apophatic," unquote. From 1927 to 1929, Staniloae visited the libraries of Europe, collecting copies of Palamite manuscripts, all of which were unpublished. He spent 10 years laboring over them, the fruit of which was a major monograph published in 1938, but also a detailed knowledge of Palamite theology that would remain an essential feature of his thought for the duration of his career. Second event. Sometime in the late 1930s, Staniloae was privy to the rediscovery of the Philokalia in Romania. This occurred first through the writer and theologian Nikifor Krajnik, who had made a great study of Orthodox mysticism, and later through 2 of Staniloae's students who returned from Mount Athos with the Greek version of St. Nicodemus. Third and finally, during this period of the 1930s, Staniloae was not only the rector of the Theological Academy in Sibiu, but also the editor of a major Romanian newspaper, Telegraful Român, in which he engaged in a sustained debate with another leading intellectual, Lucian Blaga, over the nature of Romanian culture, religion, and mysticism. Blaga's group sought to de-Christianize the latter entirely. It was in this context Staniloae immediately realized the importance of the Philokalia as encountering the popularization of these new religious experiences, which were subjective, ambiguous, directionless, and held to be of value in themselves. In other words, exactly the antidote to the false mysticism popularized among the intelligentsia. The writings of the Philokalia, and specifically those of St. Maximus, provided an authentic Christian mysticism based on the patristic science of the soul, tested through generations, and which properly assessed the value of the world. Moreover, he saw its value not only for monastics, but for all Christians, since its writings presented, quote, "practical teachings on the Orthodox way of life, which can transform us day to day and give step-by-step guidance towards a definitive goal of transforming passions into virtues, which culminate in love and union with God." The content of the Philokalia was therefore essential for the life of the church, since it could provide, quote, a precise and specifically orthodox content to preaching and Christian living, unquote. So important did Stanislaus see these writings that he could not wait 10 or even 100 years that it might take for the critical editions of these writings to be compiled, in his own words. He began translating immediately, sometime around 1940. This would eventually result in his lifelong project of producing the 12 volumes of the expanded and richly annotated Romanian Philokalia. However, the Greek Philokalia was not Stanislaus' first exposure to St. Maximus, nor can it entirely explain his grasping of the saint's importance and subsequent dedication to his writings. Indeed, through the 1930s, the prevailing scholarly opinion, which Stanislaus knew well, was that St. Maximus was devoid of originality. Yet in 1944, Stanislaus published a translation of the Mystagogia. It is in the preface of this translation that Stanislaus mentions the beautiful study of Hans Urs von Balthasar, Kosmische Liturgie, published in 1941, which went against the poor estimation of St. Maximus then in vogue, and which demonstrated the saint's majestic and personal synthesis of the great philosophical currents of antiquity and as well the principles of patristic thought. Stanislaus recognized the saint's profound importance, providing a patristic psychology and mysticism and a foundation for the integration of the transcendent and communal aspects of the world and the church, an idea which he saw preserved in orthodoxy and permeating the soul of Romanian culture. Significantly, in this preface, he also tells us that he had ready for publication at that time more than half of the St. Maximus's corpus, that is, in 1944, when he was but 40 years of age. These translations would comprise the second and third volumes of the Romanian Philokalia, which doubled the allocation of the saint's writings as compared to the Greek collection. Even before the appearance of the Mystagogia, however, Stanislaus had published a major Christological monograph, Jesus Christ or the Restoration of Man, in 1943, that was heavily indebted to St. Maximus. Therefore, between 1941, the appearance of von Balthasar's book, and 1945, when the new regime in Romania forcibly transferred him to Bucharest, removing him as Dean of the Theological Academy and editor of the newspaper, Stanislaus had translated half of the corpus of St. Maximus the Confessor, published a major Christological monograph incorporating his thought, and prepared and published the first volume of the Romanian Philokalia. That such accomplishments took place within 5 short years, in the midst of great upheaval in Romania and personal tragedy, the death of his 11-year-old daughter in 1943, is truly astonishing. These details are important because only within the context of his goal of creating a living theology and a vibrant spiritual life in the church can we understand the place of St. Maximus in Stanislaus' work. His discovery of St. Maximus came at the apex of his work in St. Gregory Palamas, at the threshold of his work in the Philokalia, and in the midst of a struggle with a de-Christianizing culture and then government. Within this crucible, St. Maximus provided the core of St. Stanislaus' synthesis. Palamas explicated the theological aspect of our union with God through his uncreated energies. The Philokalia elucidated the human aspect by providing practical guidance in prayer and life. And St. Maximus placed the path, the goal, the world, and the church in a synthetic and all-encompassing vision, which was notably and outstandingly Christocentric. Stanislaus turned to St. Maximus' thought decisively, therefore, for a coherent Christological vision of the world, expressed at times with technical doctrinal precision, which could thereby act as a framework to incorporate and evaluate contemporary theological insights and give guidance for social concerns. We are now in a position to briefly analyze the definitive influence of St. Maximus in Stanislaus' own theological writings, the centrality of which has been noted by several scholars and can even be said to distinguish him from other Orthodox theologians engaged in the same overall project of making theology both relevant and patristically grounded. As noted above, the definitive influence of St. Maximus is already evident in his early Christological study, Jesus Christ of the Restoration of Man, from which we will take an example. So already in 1943, after just 3 years of work in the saint's writings before his first translation was published, he put out a major monograph in Christology, which he treated all the German theological and philosophical currents of the day and showed him thoroughly that he had thoroughly absorbed St. Maximus's thought already by this time. So as an example, we will look at how Stenolaya analyzes the Christology of Father Sergius Bulgakov, another Orthodox thinker. As Father Bulgakov expressed his Christology in his 1933 monograph, Agnets Boží. Bulgakov did not read St. Maximus carefully. He had a low estimation of the saint's theology and openly disagreed with St. Maximus over the issue of gnomic will in Christ, which we were discussing yesterday. Stenolaya, however, respected Bulgakov, yet he took exception to many of his views, which we cannot address here. One which illustrates Stenolaya's methodology, however, would be his analysis of Bulgakov's notion of kenosis, which was not deemed controversial. Now, I cannot possibly, in this paper now, explicate all the subtlety of Bulgakov's position or Stenolaya's, but we will note this. According to Bulgakov, in the kenosis, the Word of God laid aside his divine properties and energies, such as his omnipotence, glory, etc., and most importantly, his divine self-consciousness, remaining God objectively in nature but not in activity. Using St. Maximus, Stenolaya comes to completely different conclusions. In the Incarnation, the Word of God did not leave aside his self-consciousness, albeit as a man, this self-consciousness developed according to human nature. In this development, the lack of gnomic will directly follows from the fact that the human nature of Christ was not an hypostasis independent from the Word. And so his human will did not deliberate in a separate or autonomous manner from him, its divine subject. Nor did the Word incarnate lay aside his divine attributes, but he manifested them according to the receptivity of each person, not in an overwhelming manner which would prevent communion between him and his fellow human beings, but just enough to reveal his identity. In this, the kenosis revealed the divine omnipotence does not consist in overwhelming power, but is always subject to love. Stenolaya's analysis of Bulgakov's kenosis theory also demonstrates a key characteristic of his synthesis, his constant weaving together of St. Maximus's thought with that of St. Gregory Palamas. Bulgakov found 19th century Protestant notions of kenosis rather orthodox, in his own words, and based his own theory on them. Stenolaya, on the other hand, sees them as impoverishing the notion of the Incarnation, for it is precisely by doing divine things through human nature, and vice versa, that the uncreated energy of God flows in and through Christ to human nature and thereby to all creation. As a final example, we will briefly look at Father Stenolaya's use of a specific doctrine of St. Maximus. Readers of Father Stenolaya's work cannot but take note of his widespread and systematic use of Maximus's doctrine of the logoi, which he closely relates to the doctrine of the uncreated energies of St. Gregory Palamas. Here I would like to make a few brief observations of how Stenolaya incorporates and synthesizes these two doctrines. First, while Stenolaya maintains the ontological connection established by St. Maximus between the one logos and the many logoi in his overall doctrine of participation, he creatively draws out the implications contained in the confessor's teachings that the one logos is the hypostatic or personal logos of God. Due to this fact, the logoi of things have both ontological and existential dimensions simultaneously. From the ontological perspective, the logoi are the unchanging models and goals of all things, according to which God creates, sustains, and guides them to himself. The logoi pre-exist in an eternal, undifferentiated, and unchanging unity in God the Logos, and without departing from this simple unity, become differentiated and dynamic in the act of creation. From the existential perspective, however, each logos can reveal multiple meanings, which are words of God directed towards each individual believer. One consequence of this is that Stenolaia sees the contemplation of nature, which is the ability to see the logoi of things unaffected and undistorted by passionate attachment, as a form of personal dialogue between God and each human person. Through ascetic purification and the seeking of the logoi, man sees the thoughts and loving intentions of God personally directed to him. Since they are rooted in the personal logos, the logoi foster personal dialogue, ultimately conveying God's love to us and stimulating our love for God. Without this existential dialogical aspect, the world itself would have no meaning. Stenolaia's emphasis on the personal aspect of the logos-logoi doctrine highlights his notion that person, or interpersonal communion, is always the goal of the contemplation of nature, and nature is the means and irreducible ground of this communion. In this manner, the logos-logoi doctrine allows Father Stenolaia to establish a theological foundation for an ascetic spirituality which leaves out no aspect of reality from the divine-human dialogue. As a second issue, I would like to raise the question of Stenolaia's identification of the logoi with the uncreated energies elaborated by St. Gregory Palamas, an issue which has yet to receive a definitive clarity among St. Maximus's many commentators. Stenolaia deftly integrates the logoi and the uncreated energies, all the while remaining within the framework established by St. Maximus. Whereas Stenolaia identifies the logoi with uncreated energies, yet he does so with some basic distinctions. First, each logos, while clearly pre-existing and uncreated, is always identifiable through a specific created thing or a specific attribute of God. The uncreated energies, on the other hand, are not integrally connected to specific beings or attributes. However, this does not mean that the uncreated energies cannot be mediated through created things. Secondly, the uncreated energies reveal the logoi in things and the attributes of God in motion. This becomes especially clear in natural contemplation, in which the ascent through created things to see their logoi occurs not only through ascetic purification, but with the help of grace, which Stenolaia identifies as the uncreated energies. The energies serve to illumine the mind to see the logoi in things and lead the mind through the logoi to their source, the one personal logos of God. Finally, we see the distinction between the logoi and the energies in the difference between contemplation in this present life and in the future age. In the present life, we look directly at created things and through them, indirectly, to their logoi, which reveal the one logos. However, in the future age, we will see the logoi directly in the one logos and created things only indirectly. This is not because created things will disappear, but because they will become transparent in the infinite light of the uncreated energies. We will conclude with a few brief observations. First, the influence of St. Maximus is ubiquitous in Father Stenolaia's work. It is prominent in his discussions of the Trinity, of Christ, the Church, the world, asceticism, and deification, and most especially in his integral view of person and nature in both the Holy Trinity and in humanity. Indeed, in contemporary Orthodox theology, Stenolaia's dedication to the saint and the subsequent influence of the saint on his own thought is perhaps unique. But not only in content, but also in methodology, we can say that Father Stenolaia is truly a disciple of St. Maximus in his primary goal to serve the Church, in his refusal to separate dogma from life, and in his willingness to cite theologians and thinkers from every era, accepting the good while leaving aside the unacceptable. As a result, he produced a rich theological synthesis which is both traditional and contemporary simultaneously. Secondly, one must appreciate the place of St. Maximus in Stenolaia's theological synthesis, which is an integration of Orthodox thought and life. St. Gregory Palamas revealed to him a God that comes to man, embracing and enlightening him with his uncreated energies. The Philokalia presented a step-by-step guide to purification and deification, and St. Maximus synthesized these aspects, revealing that the desire for and the task of struggling to receive the gift of deification was rooted in human nature, embedded in the very structure of the world, and in all cases, fulfilled in Christ. These themes are wonderfully synthesized in the conclusion of Father Stanowaya's great work on Orthodox asceticism and mysticism. And I'll conclude with this quote. The incarnation of the Word gave man the possibility to see in the human face of the Logos, concentrated anew, all the logoi and divine energies. This final deification will consist of a contemplation and experience of all the divine logoi and uncreated energies conceived in and radiating from the face of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Kalinik. Our second speaker is Paul Gavrilyuk from the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He is a very accomplished author and scholar in theology and historical theology. He has written what is arguably one of the most important books on the whole question of the impassibility of God in early Christian thought. Suffering of the Impassible God, the Dialectics of Patristic Thought, published by Oxford in 2004. So we are welcoming him to speak to us on Father Florovsky and his reading of Maximus. Was it anti-Bulgakov or pro-Bulgakov?
Thank you. Well, I would like to join other speakers in expressing my thanks to the organizers of the conference. The event of this size, as we all know, takes months of careful preparation. So thank you for your wonderful hospitality and for the truly excellent organization, oblivious as we are sometimes to the constraints of time. I particularly appreciate the medicinal qualities of Žuta Osa. Now, to the uninitiated, Žuta Osa is that wonderful yellow rum that we are offered just about at every meal. Certain theological debates can be settled by simply imbibing this particular drink. Not all of them, but certain could be. Now, it is especially comforting that St. Maximus is venerated at our conference not only in the sanctuary of our minds, but also in the Church's services, in Vespers, in the liturgy, in the relics of the saint that we are given such a wonderful opportunity to adore, in the icons, and even in the new hymns. I think that's a great testimony to the incarnational vision of the saint. If I may be allowed to paraphrase St. Basil of Caesarea, the honor paid to Maximus passes on to the Logos. And one hopes that our logoi about Maximus's theology, to the extent to which they are true, reflect the wisdom of the divine Logos. Now, the subject of this paper is George Florovsky's rarely considered treatment of Maximus the Confessor. This treatment, I will argue, contains some vital clues for understanding Florovsky's main theological project, namely his neo-patristic synthesis. More precisely, what Florovsky calls Maximus's creative and transformative synthesis provides a major paradigm for doing neo-patristic theology, I will suggest. One may also discern in Florovsky's reading of Maximus a subtle, indirect dialogue with Bulgakov, to whose work Father Kalinik already referred in his presentation. By engaging Maximus's theory of the divine logoi, Florovsky follows the metaphysical trajectory of Bulgakov's sophiology as far as he can. If in the final analysis Florovsky parts ways with Bulgakov, it is a friendly parting of the ways, which owes much to Bulgakov's sophiology. Now, I argue this point in more general terms in my forthcoming book, George Florovsky and the Russian Religious Renaissance. I call in that study for a revision of the narrative which casts the theological modernism of Bulgakov's generation exclusively in terms of opposition to the neo-patristic direction of Florovsky's generation. Now, Florovsky discusses Maximus in the penultimate chapter of the second volume of his Patrology Lectures entitled The Byzantine Fathers of the 5th, 8th Centuries. The lectures were delivered at the St. Sergius Orthodox Theological Institute in Paris from 1928 to 1931. They were subsequently typed up by Yelizaveta Skoptsova, future Mother Maria and now, of course, a saint, and published by the YMCA Press in 1933. In his lectures, Florovsky combined two common approaches to patrology. One approach was an author-by-author review of the ancient Christian literature. The second approach, developed during the 19th century, was Dogmengeschichte, or the history of ideas. Florovsky defined Dogmengeschichte as uncovering, and I quote, the internal dialectics of the Christian mind, and as identifying the main, quote, types and trends of Christian thought, unquote. But Florovsky's lectures were also meant to become more than a useful survey of this kind. In addition to purely expository function, the lectures provided a historical platform for Florovsky's own theological program. In the introduction to the first volume, The Eastern Fathers of the 4th Century, Florovsky declared, and I would like now to turn your attention to the handout, and that would be the quote number 1 on the handout. And so Florovsky declared, I believe and know that only it, namely patristic theology, opens the right and true way towards a new Christian synthesis craved and sought after in our time. End of quotation. The general thrust of his emerging program of the return to the Fathers was in evidence in this declaration. Now, it is instructive to compare this declaration to the preface of The Ways of Russian Theology, where Florovsky wrote, and this is the quote number 2 on your handout. The study of the Russian past has convinced me that an Orthodox theologian today can find the true norm and the living spring of creative inspiration only in the heritage of the Holy Fathers. I am convinced that the intellectual separation from patristics and Byzantinism was the main cause of all interruptions and spiritual failures in Russian development. A history of these failures is narrated in this book. End of quotation. So The Ways of Russian Theology told the story of how the Western influences of Russian theology led to failures and dead ends. The Patrology Lectures began to offer a way out of this impasse, namely a return to the ways of Byzantine theology, which incidentally was the expression Florovsky used as a title of the introduction to his second Patrology volume. So despite the promising introductory announcement that, to repeat, patristic theology opens the right and true way towards a new Christian synthesis, end of quote, the lectures themselves, the Patrology Lectures themselves, offered only scattered hints as to how such a new synthesis could be achieved. In fact, in the Patrology Lectures and elsewhere, Florovsky rarely, if at all, speaks of the operation of a synthesis with sufficient methodological precision, a fact nearly universally acknowledged. Schmemann, of course, was particularly volunteering to make that point clear. In the Patrology Lectures, Florovsky located the synthesizing activity in the past by attributing the achievement of a synthesis either to an individual church father or to a specific period in church history. So several examples of Florovsky's use of the term synthesis will suffice to illustrate this point. According to Florovsky, for example, the theology of Basil of Caesarea was a theological metaphysical synthesis, formulating the Church's faith more precisely by means of Greek philosophical terminology. In contrast, Ephraim the Syrian offered, I quote, an artistic synthesis of pastoral rather than doctrinal significance. To use another example, Emperor Justinian had achieved what Florovsky called a short-lived theocratic synthesis, which involved a tension between the Holy Empire and the monastic desert. Florovsky also spoke of a synthesis as reached during a specific historical period. Painting on a larger historical canvas, he presented patristic theology as a synthesis of the apostolic kerygma with the Greek philosophy, which resulted in what he called Christian Hellenism or Christian philosophy. Now, in this scheme, the Council of Chalcedon was a landmark event in the battle between the Alexandrian and the Antiochian theological traditions, ushering in an integral synthesis, Russian here is celostny synthesis, to be fully achieved in the Byzantine period. Now, according to Florovsky, the pinnacle of this development was the theology of Maximus the Confessor. It was Maximus, not John of Damascus, who, in Florovsky's judgment, provided the new theological synthesis rooted in ascetic experience. Florovsky clearly intended a parallel between Maximus's new theological synthesis and his own new Christian synthesis. While Florovsky never made this claim explicitly, Maximus's theology furnished the most satisfying paradigm for developing the neo-patristic synthesis. Florovsky's treatment of Maximus, while extensive, also had to be selective. The themes that Florovsky considered in some detail, specifically the doctrine of revelation and Christology, were essential both to Maximus's vision and to Florovsky's developing neo-patristic theology. It is difficult to judge how well Florovsky knew Maximus's works in the original. Florovsky's Patrology contains no footnotes, but only a single summary bibliographic endnote to each chapter. It is likely that he consulted the 19th and 91st volumes of Means Patrologia Graeca mentioned in that endnote. Now, another important source was a book, St. Maximus the Confessor and Byzantine Theology, Святой Максим Исповедник и Византийское Богословие, published in 1915 by the professor of Kiev Theological Academy, Sergei Yepifanovich. By the way, the wonderful bibliography with which we were presented yesterday, incidentally, actually contains all works, all published works of Epifanovich up to this day. So I think the bibliography itself is just a godsend, obviously, for the particularly assiduous graduate students, and also will strike the fear of God into sort of relatively lax graduate students. In the beginning of the 20th century, Epifanovich's important monograph was one of the first explorations in the emerging field of the Maximian studies. It is my understanding that the publication of Epifanovich's previously unpublished studies, totaling some 1,500 pages, is currently in preparation in Kiev. Epifanovich presented Maximus as, quote, possessing an extraordinary power of creative synthesis, unquote. According to the Ukrainian scholar, Maximus was no mere compiler of authoritative patristic opinions. Rather, he, that is Maximus, was able to integrate the different currents of patristic thought into a unified theological vision. This vision, continued Epifanovich, was profoundly shaped by Maximus's ascetic and mystical experience. In Epifanovich's words, quote, Maximus's dogmatic theology is integrated into his ascetic theology, unquote. Maximus doesn't provide a merely external rational justification of the teachings of the Church, but achieves a transformation of the Church's teachings in light of ascetic experience. On all these points, the characterization of Maximus's theology as a creative synthesis, the emphasis on the transforming role of ascetic experience, Florovsky closely followed Epifanovich's presentation of Maximus. Florovsky was equally convinced that while Maximus didn't produce a comprehensive theological system, his theological vision nevertheless possessed a considerable internal unity. Florovsky aptly describes Maximus's theology as, I quote, a symphony of spiritual experience, end quote. The unifying theme of this symphony was Christology. Florovsky was especially keen to emphasize the centrality of Christology not only in Maximus's soteriology, but also in his account of revelation, creation, human nature, ecclesiology, and so on. Florovsky, whose own theological vision was firmly Christocentric, especially appreciated the extent to which the doctrine of God-man informed all aspects of Maximus's thought. Now, more generally, Epiphanovich construed the development of Byzantine theology as pagan Neoplatonism gradually ceding ground to and finally being superseded by Christian philosophy. So, for example, pagan pantheism, which represented the world as an eternal and necessary outflowing of the divine being, gave way to the Christian idea that the world was a contingent creation of the free divine will. This idea played a prominent role in Florovsky's historiography. For Florovsky, the intuition of creaturehood was one of the defining moments of Christian philosophy and Christian Hellenism. Florovsky opposed the intuition of creaturehood to the pantheism of non-Christian Platonism, which he invariably detected in Origenism, German idealism, and Russian sociology. Florovsky stressed that Maximus rejected the speculation that the world was co-eternal with God. Florovsky most probably had in mind the passage from the chapters on love, by the way, presently available in this magnificent CD edition produced by Bishop Maximus and also narrated by Father Josiah Trenham. So don't leave your home without it. So it is possible that Florovsky had in mind the passage from the chapters in Love 4:6. Notice that the 4th century is receiving quite substantial attention at these days of the conference, where Maximus wrote, and I quote, this is your quote number 3. Now some say, Maximus says, that created things eternally exist with God, which is impossible. For how can what is limited in every way eternally coexist with the wholly infinite? Or how are they really creatures if they are co-eternal with the Creator? But this is the theory of the Greeks, who admit God as the Creator, not of the substance at all, but only of the properties. But we, who know the Almighty God, affirm that He is the Creator, not of the properties, but of the substance endowed with properties. And if this is true, creatures do not eternally coexist with God. End of quotation. Now, this particular point was, of course, shared by an overwhelming majority of Orthodox patristic theologians. Maximus's distinct contribution to this development was his doctrine of the divine logoi. Drawing on Epiphanovich, Florovsky acknowledges the complexity and multiplicity of meanings and functions that Maximus ascribes to the divine logoi. And as Florovsky himself explains, and this is the last quotation on the handout, first, says Florovsky, the logoi are the divine thoughts and volitions, prejudgments and predeterminations of the divine will, the eternal thoughts of the eternal mind, in which thoughts God conceives and cognizes the world. As creative rays, the logoi come from the divine center and are drawn back into it. And then the second meaning is that the divine logoi are the dynamic paradigms of things. The logos of the thing is not only its truth and meaning, not only its law and definition, but first of all, its originating principle. End of quotation. So God reveals Himself in creation through the logoi. The deified human mind perceives the divine logoi in and through creation. The logoi therefore provide the links that enable the world to participate in God. The logoi are the principles mediating between God and the world. Now, a serious aporia presents itself at this point. What precisely is the ontological status of the divine logoi? Are the logoi created or uncreated? Florovsky interprets Maximus as teaching that the logoi are divine volitions, or more precisely, eternal divine volitional thoughts about creation. As such, the divine logoi are ontologically prior to the creation of the world. Maximus states in Ambiguous 7 that the eternity of the logoi does not entail the eternity of the world. God eternally plans and wills to create the world in time. In the act of creation, God's eternal will produces time-bound creation that is something other than God. Now, while the world is not co-eternal with God, as was made explicit in the chapters on love 4:6, the divine volitional thoughts about the world are eternal. God eternally plans and wills to become incarnate and save the world. But Maximus explicitly denies that Christ's human nature pre-exists the incarnation. While the line between the eternal divine volitional thoughts and the time-bound actualization of these thoughts is admittedly very fine, Florovsky is determined, with the help of Maximus, to draw and keep this line. I should notice that 2 years from the publication of this material, Vladimir Lossky will take this and transpose it onto his debate, public debate, what was actually a public debate with Bulgakov. Now, while Palamas' teaching regarding the divine energies in many aspects corresponds to Maximus' teaching regarding the divine logos, I shall not open the Pandora's box of potential issues that could be generated by correlating the two teachings. Now, the more pressing question is the connection of everything that has been said about the Maximian theory of the divine logoi to Bulgakov's sophiology. For Bulgakov, Sophia, or the divine humanity, has a mixed ontological status. Similar to the God-man, the Sophia is both uncreated and created. The Sophia is the eternal ground of the temporal world. Now, even more controversially, Bulgakov aligns the ideal world closely with the expression of the divine essence. In Bulgakov, the ideal Sophianic world expresses the content of the divine life, and in this sense, the ideal world is necessary for God. Now, Bulgakov clearly agreed with Maximus and Florovsky that the divine plan about the world was eternal. But Bulgakov went a step further and reified, so to speak, the eternal divine volitional thoughts about the world into the eternal ground of the world, which was at once created and uncreated, at once co-eternal with God and temporal. Now, Vladimir Lossky and less directly Florovsky proceeded to draw the problematic implications that Bulgakov's sophiology entailed pantheism, pagan emanationism, determinism, essentialism, and a catalogue of other heresies. Now, these charges were and remain powerful rhetorically. Many contemporary Orthodox readers simply avoid a serious reading of Bulgakov because of those charges. Nevertheless, I want to emphasize that Bulgakov's panentheism attempted to do justice to the best insights of the creatio ex nihilo doctrine, although ultimately Bulgakov modified this doctrine considerably. And so, according to Bulgakov, God creates the temporal world out of the Sophianic world already existing in God. For Maximus, God created by means of his volitional thoughts, by means of the uncreated entities containing information, so to speak, about created beings. Now, I personally do not see Florovsky and Maximus as fighting on the side of the angels, and Bulgakov as languishing in the limbo reserved for Origenists, pantheists, German philosophers. I was saying something about the limbo in which they are languishing. So I think that where is my limbo? Well, let me...
But it didn't fall on you, at least.
I still personally do not see Florovsky and Maximus as fighting on the side of the angels, and Bulgakov is languishing in the limbo reserved for Origenists, pantheists. I think I mentioned too many of them, that's the reason. Pantheists, German philosophers, and other questionable characters. What is at stake here is a general antinomy that the human mind comes to when pondering the boundary between the uncreated, that is to say God and everything around God, and the created world. For if the concept of such a boundary has any meaning at all, and I think that could be helpfully debated, so if the concept of the boundary between created and uncreated has any meaning at all, the boundary itself has to be both created and uncreated, the fundamental insight that Bulgakov was trying to convey by insisting on this dual nature of the Sophia. So our language and logic break down when we attempt to articulate a transition from the uncreated to created. Bulgakov's panentheism and Florovsky's ontology of creation out of nothing tended to prioritize one side of theological antinomies at the expense of the other side. This is to be expected, since the antinomic language is inherently unstable, and it is nearly impossible to maintain a consistent balance between both sides of the antinomies. Bulgakov, for his part, prioritized the union of creator and creation at the expense of their ontological difference, the connection between the eternal nature of God and the divine self-manifestation at the expense of the uniqueness of the historical divine revelation, divine providence at the expense of human freedom, the fullness of divine life at the expense of human creativity, and so on. Florovsky, with his intuition of creaturehood, on the contrary, prioritized the ontological difference between God and the world at the expense of the divine-human communion, the uniqueness of the historical divine revelation in Christ at the expense of the eternal divine counsel regarding the human salvation, the indeterminate character of human freedom at the expense of divine providence, the genuine novelty of contingent historical events at the expense of the divine omniscience. As a point of historical interpretation, we may conclude that Florovsky's reading of Maximus was distinctly anti-Bulgakov. However, the problem at stake in the sociological controversy ran deeper than the facile distinction between Florovsky, who remained faithful to the Church Fathers, and Bulgakov, who failed in the task, may suggest. The problem, I would submit, was in pondering the boundary between the uncreated and created, in pondering the deep mystery of just how a God who transcended all created things brought forth a being at once utterly dependent and utterly different from himself, the created world. Thank you very much.
Thank you for two very fine papers on two very important contemporary appropriations of Maximus's thought. I thought Paul Gavrilyuk needs to be congratulated on making the most violent point at this conference. With the So we open our time now for questions, and I assume we have our microphone ready to go over here. Okay, so I open the floor to questions. Father Andrew Loff.
Father Kalinick, just a comment. So I'd like you to sort of comment on yourself. You mentioned the importance of Kleinik.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry, Father.
Is this working?
Yes, now.
Yeah. You mentioned the importance of Kleinik in the background to Father Staniloy's discovery of the Philokalia. And I just wondered, Kleinik himself, of course, was almost kind of internal convert to Orthodoxy, wasn't he? He came to Orthodoxy when he was in Vienna, when he discovered the work of Hugo Ball, who was a significant figure in the kind of cultural history of Vienna. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that. It seems to me one thing very interesting about Orthodoxy in the period between the two wars is the way in which the Orthodox themselves discovered themselves in relation to other people.
Yeah, that is true. I don't know the details of what led Kreinik to be interested, first of all, in mysticism in general, and then in Eastern mysticism. And he had this famous course that he was offering, which was actually typed out on a typewriter and distributed in Bucharest, a course on mysticism. And sometime 1935 or 1936, Kreinik discovered the Philokalia. Actually, what he discovered was a poor Romanian translation, which was more of a summary, interspersed with detailed commentary of how to live it out, which was, in their view, written by a Paisian monk, an anonymous Paisian monk. they couldn't use that or publish it because the translation was inaccurate vis-a-vis the Greek texts. So when he saw that, he actually wrote to Father Staniloae and told him this, and said that this is exactly what I was looking for to ground my course and my conceptions of Eastern mysticism. There's this whole wealth of patristic tradition available. It wasn't until later, I think it was in 1939 or 38, that Father Staniloae had two disciples, one of which was Father Arseny Popochok, who went to Mount Athos. They were students of his who became hieromonks, and they brought back the 2-volume version of St. Nicodemus. And that's when serious work on the Philokalia and the whole rejuvenation of this happened in Romania. Not only academically, I might add, but spiritually. Around the Brancoviano monastery, there's a whole bunch of people trying to live this, and they actually financed the publication of these volumes personally during the war, during the Second World War. By that time, Kreinik was out of the picture. He was actually in hiding.
David Bradshaw?
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question for Paul Gavriliuk. I appreciate your paper. It's very interesting to learn some of the historical background of these debates. But I want to pick up the philosophical point you raised when you said that the boundary between God and creation must be both created and uncreated, and that's what gives rise to these antinomies. The reason I'm not comfortable with that way of putting it is that it's using a spatial metaphor, as if God were one place, what he creates were another place, and they're somehow separated. You know, the only time I can think of when Scripture does use a spatial metaphor for this relationship, it's that God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, which precisely does not posit a boundary, right? More typically, I think the fathers, you know, they don't think of it in spatial terms. They think of it in terms of an agent and his act, or his acts. So that, say, the divine processions in Dionysius are acts, being, life, goodness, and so forth. And the divine energies are acts. And creation itself is an act that God performs. And there's not a boundary between myself and my act, right? So I wonder if, you know, it seems to me that metaphor is one that is very dubious. Is there another way you'd like to make that point that could avoid that metaphor, which I think is not a good one?
Yes. Well, David, thank you for this question. I think this allows me to develop somewhat the point that I was trying to qualify, and that is, in the presentation I said that if the notion of boundary is not meaningless, then it forces you to think through the question in what way is the boundary created, the boundary then has to be created and uncreated. Now, for example, there could be all kinds of examples where the term boundary would simply be irrelevant. So, for example, what is the boundary between sound, la, and color, red? Well, there is none, because they do not meet in some general genus in this case. And so the question that you raised, again, one of the issues is, does the notion of a boundary assume space? Okay, so is that assumption, does that assumption sort of follow immediately, and why should one be wedded to the concept of a boundary? And so Bulgakov's position inevitably locks him into the situation of assuming, yes, you have to have a boundary. That's to say, yes, you have to have. And it's precisely what, for example, causes him to postulate kenosis vis-a-vis creation. That is to say, he postulates kenosis not only vis-a-vis Christology, but also in creation, as in some forms of mysticism, etc., God has to retire, if you will, from God's self to free up the space, if you will, for creation. That is to say, the non-God has to be generated because, after all, God is precisely infinite. Okay? And so, of course, lots of questions could be raised precisely regarding that point, because one could say that creatio ex nihilo doctrine is trying to account for the fact that God creates something entirely novel. God simply creates a non-God. And therefore, postulating kenosis, at least vis-a-vis that particular point, really is unnecessary. However, let me just dwell on what you said afterwards, and that is that the question of the antinomy might or might not arise if we couch this in terms of the language of action. That is to say, that God's action, God's activity, energeia. Let me just stick to the English in this case, just to make it sharper and more precise. So, if one thinks of the divine activity or action vis-a-vis the world, and I'm of course obviously entirely comfortable with that language, one would have to say this, that there is a divine activity that results in God, namely the generation of the Son and the procession of the Holy Spirit. These are two distinct types of divine activity that result in God. And then there is a type of divine activity that results in non-God, namely in the created world. And so then still the question would arise as to at what point does the divine agent that initiates an activity that is completely divine effectively come to a point when that activity is non-divine. And I think you probably would say, well, now you're locking me into the temporal metaphor of a point, if you will, on that continuum. But what if divine action, in this case, is divine action sui generis? And again, if I am locked in that particular then sort of predicament, I would then say that creatio ex nihilo is a divine action sui generis. But with this said, unfortunately, I would then not have many analogies that would then explicate what the term precisely means, other than saying something like this, that the divine act of creation out of nothing is distinct from the divine act of the generation of the Son and the divine act of the procession of the Holy Spirit, and it's distinct from everything else that God does in the world, where of course He doesn't create out of nothing, but rather creates or recreates the state of affairs out of something. So notice that if I'm not making any of the moves that I've just made before, I still am left with the question of how one conceives and conceptualizes creation out of nothing. And I would actually welcome a rebuttal, if you will, or perhaps a response.
I'm sorry. When it comes to explaining or describing creation out of nothing, I'm probably not going to be able to help. What your question puts me in mind of the classic discussion in St. Athanasius, which I'm sure you know, that begetting and procession are acts of nature, whereas creation is an act of will. Of course, Florovsky has a whole article on this very distinction, right? And that's one way of trying to avoid the necessitarian emanationism that I think otherwise is threatened. We don't have to look at German pantheism. We can go back to Plotinus.
Yeah.
Or even elsewhere in ancient Greek philosophy. This is always the question: how do you understand the relation of God to creation in a way that sort of does justice to divine freedom without making it arbitrary or capricious? That's what, as I see it, the role of the logoi in Maximus. So, at any rate.
Let me just say very quickly, because I really don't, I know we have other things to discuss, but I don't quite want to lose that point. I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. Of course, for Florovsky's work on creation, that distinction between the act of essence and the act of will is of enormous significance. The question, however, is I need to be convinced that A, philosophically it will actually hold any water. Because I really do not know what it is to say for the human action, well, this is an act of essence, and this is the act of will. I'm not entirely sure how the distinction could actually be made cogently. The second issue, of course, it is yet another form of violation of divine simplicity. And you could say, well, we're Orthodox, we're sort of soft on divine simplicity anyway, so we just don't worry about that stuff. Well, I am, actually. I mean, for me, it is a serious matter of how precisely one introduces that distinction. I mean, this said, I would agree that this was a genuine terminological breakthrough in the discussion that precisely happens as Athanasius discusses this matter. So I certainly would agree that that is the case. But notice what Bulgakov is trying to do. Bulgakov is trying to say that the act of the creation of the world, while it certainly is not somehow intrinsic completely to what happens to the in the inner life of the Trinity, nevertheless, if you will, has a bearing on the Father's generation of the Logos. Then in generating the Logos, the Father also generates all the Logoi inherent in the Logos, and therefore, to some extent, as far as Bulgakov, the logic of Bulgakov's position is concerned, the ground for the created world is already there in the act of generation of the sun. Now, you could say, well, this is just an exercise in futility. But I think, again, Bulgakov's point is to try to align as closely as possible, essentially, as closely as possible, essentially the inner life of the Trinity with, of course, what happens in salvation history. And I think the last very short point that I would like to make is that in some sense it was an invitation to a certain form of epistemological humility that I think Bulgakov lacked, actually, in describing these matters, but without just simply a kind of diffusive sort of mist, if you will, of apophatic language that we usually add to these discussions. So I'm certainly not saying, well, my account of this breaks down, therefore one has to be apophatic. I'm not quite making that move at all. I mean, there is apophaticism, and there is apophaticism run amok, and there is apophaticism that's simply nonsense. But I do want to say that it's actually terribly difficult to talk about this language in such a way that you actually have sensible analogies of it.
I might add something if I may. I don't claim to have the answer, but we can look to St. Maximus for some guidance in it, precisely in the difference between St. Maximus's doctrine of the Logos Logoi and Bulgakov's uncreated Sophia theory. And that is this, that St. Maximus says, I believe in Ambiguum 10, that the whole God is in each energy, in each creature, at the level of its Logos. And the Logoi not only create, but they sustain and guide creation. So God creates something other than himself without separating himself from his creature. Okay? Now, we as free creatures, we can align our nature according to that Logos or not, guide ourselves towards God or not. The difference, I think, between Bulgakov and St. Maximus is that before creating in St. Maximus, he's very clear that all the logoi are in the one Logos in an undifferentiated manner, in a perfect unity. That's not intelligible. That's beyond creation. Whereas in Bulgakov, the problem is, which leads to all these people accusing him of teaching a voluntaristic or predestination view of the world, is that Sophia is not undifferentiated. It's already differentiated, but on the level of creation, as an exact mirror of the created world, or as how it should be. That's where the problem comes in.
If it is the case that the logoi are undifferentiated, what sense does it make to speak of the logoi as multiple?
They are multiple when they are active in creating, in creation. I'm just quoting St. Maximus, this is not my teaching. He's very clear. In the one Logos, they are undifferentiated and unified. There are several adjectives used. I believe it's in Ambiguum 10 or Ambiguum 7, perhaps.
I have a profound difficulty with the notion of quoting a patristic authority for something that is a purely logical difficulty. And
I'm not saying
undifferentiating logoi are not multiple. There is no epistemic
No, they're not
warrant.
multiple. They're not multiple in the one Logos.
Well, therefore, it makes no sense to speak of them as multiple.
They're multiple in creation. And each creature has its own Logos. I preface my remark by saying I don't have the solution. I'm just looking to St. Maximus for guidance.
We have a question from Telly.
I want to pick up on this. Perhaps this directly relates to a very good discussion, I think, because I think, while I would agree that Bulgakov may not have read Maximus carefully, because I actually think out of all the fathers of the Church, there's more affinity between Maximus and Bulgakov than anybody else. And so I would encourage young theologians to do a dissertation on Maximus and Bulgakov, so you can help us with this debate. Because I think that one of the things I've learned from the secondary sources, from Joshua's dissertation and from Torstein's book, is that, and this is, and I defer to the Maximus scholars here, because maybe I'm getting this wrong, but Maximus had a sense that God is eternally creator, because of the Logos, the relationship of the Logos and the Logi. And if you really think about it, it is absolutely, fundamentally impossible for us to think God than in any other way than as creator. This doesn't necessarily mean that God is necessitated to create. It just means that it's impossible for us to think God other than God in relationship to creation. And this is Bulgakov's point, and this is Maximus's point, I think. So I find an affinity there, and Paul, this question is directly related to you, in the sense that Florovsky either failed or just refused to see that in Maximus because it might give, and perhaps I'm reading too much into this, might give too much to Bulgakov, right? And then my second question is to Father Kalnick in the sense that Staniloae is the only one that I know of to use the love analogy to talk about the Trinity in contemporary Orthodox theology. In fact, there are explicit Orthodox theologians who think that, because obviously that comes from Augustine, that's awful, right? So Staniloae uses it explicitly, and the footnotes are to Florensky for that, in terms of the reference. Now, in some sense, we know there's a very positive relationship between Florensky and Bulgakov. And so in some sense, I mean, there's also a kind of positive relationship of Staniloae to that tradition, which perhaps you might want to illuminate on. So.
Well, let me use an analogy that might strike you as somewhat irrelevant, but I think that due recognition has to be made about how intractable the problem that they're struggling with is. That's to say, suppose I'm dealing with something like mind-body problem. And all I'm doing is I'm deferring to a number of patristic authorities or a number of authors that I don't particularly like and say, well, they've resolved it in the wrong way, and now I've got the right way, here it is. And so in 5 minutes we have a solution to the mind-body problem. Now you realize this is a perpetually contested philosophical question. What I'm arguing in this case is that the status of something like creatio ex nihilo has the same type of thing. Now it's true that creatio ex nihilo is implicitly canonized in Nicaea. Basically, at Nicaea, I mean, the second anathema appears to be canonizing it more or less implicitly, and obviously, creatio ex nihilo is taken to be a corollary also of divine omnipotence. So, to the extent to which the Creed states that, it's obviously a canonical doctrine. But it's rather interesting, actually, that it's kept on this particular level. Frankly, personally, I think you're inviting a systematic theological reflection on it. You're not necessarily asking for the interpretation of Maximus. So I want to announce that I'm moving from Maximus to something else, and that is to Irenaeus. Okay, and Irenaeus, in the discussion of the Gnostics, says this. Fundamentally, is that whatever explanation we provide for the beginning of the world, it better be an explanation that clarifies things, illuminates things that are pretty obscure, and doesn't do the other thing. And so for me, for example, multiplying logoi and then subsequently generating also the notion of energies that somehow stand between creation and God, okay? Multiplying these categories in this way doesn't actually provide the best possible explanation. And so this is somewhat like for example, the kinds of problems that the scientific community has with the intelligent design people. Is that at some point they simply say, well, we account for these complex biological mechanisms by the thoughts in the mind of God. And I have no cognitive access to the thoughts of the mind of God other than through creation. And therefore I'm actually, looking at this in a kind of a big circle, in a sense. So what Irenaeus, to come back to Irenaeus what says is that the Gnostics are trying to account for the world by looking at something in God. Okay, so they're postulating a world, tears of divine Sophia, intelligible, etc., a world in God. And so what they end up doing, what ends up happening is a kind of an infinite regress to a state before the state of this world that somehow exists in God. And Irenaeus, I think in a remarkably non-speculative mode, wants to cut through that and to affirm, in the rule of faith, if you will, to affirm creatio ex nihilo, meaning precisely that God had absolutely nothing to create the world. So in that regard, I mean, if I were to function in a kind of a systematic theological mode, I would actually side with Irenaeus. I actually do not see here, particularly strong form of something that is really rendered here by way of an explanation. But I certainly could be corrected.
Well, Telly, you asked a real Lulu of a question. Staniloae's doctrine of love and the Trinity. And I'm going to begin by relating your question to something that David Bradshaw said about the distinction that Florovsky makes in St. Athanasius between what is of nature and what is of will. Creation is absolutely of will. But he also says that when the Son is generated from the Father, it is not without the Father's evdokia, which means it involves love of the Father as well, the person of the Father. It's an essential relation, but not without the Father's person. It's not something automated, the procession, the beginning of the Son, rather, and the procession of the Holy Spirit. Now, Father Stanislaus' doctrine of love is based on Byzantine pneumatology and a little bit of Augustine, and that is that the Holy Spirit proceeds, not subsequent, but simultaneously and within the beginning of the Son. And he proceeds to the Son, and he rests in the Son, and he's manifested from the Son to the Father. And this is an essential relation in God, but it's also a personal relation. And it's one that involves love. And it's a love that is so deep that there is a transposition of I's, if you will, in modern language. Like St. Paul says, it's not I who lives, but Christ lives in me. Or we say to somebody that we love, there's a place for you in my heart. When two people have that relationship, perhaps a parent for the child or spouses, there's a melding of the soul. Well, in St. Maximus the Confessor, for example, in Capita Gnostica, I believe in the first chapter of the second book, he has this long poetic symmetry that the whole Father is in the whole essence, and the whole essence is in the whole Father. And he repeats that for each member of the Trinity. Then he says the whole Father is in the whole Son and in the Holy Spirit, whole Spirit. And the whole Son is in the whole Father and the whole Spirit. In other words, there's this complete perichoresis, inner dwelling. And in that, Father Stanislaus definitely, using the Byzantine pneumatology and these sayings from St. Maximus, he reflects at length on the love within the Holy Trinity. Those are his guidelines, his framework. He does not stray from that dogmatic framework. And once that dogmatic framework is respected and held and not violated, then he can bring in people like Bulgakov, which he read very carefully and respected Bulgakov, but didn't disagree with him when Bulgakov seemed to stray out of these dogmatic frameworks. And Florensky, who is very creative, said, oh, I read them all. He read everyone. And he got a beautiful insight from everyone, as long as it stayed within this dogmatic framework established primarily by St. Maximus the Confessor. So does that answer? I think that answers your second question, too, about his relationship with the Russian tradition, which was positive.
Would it be possible to actually offer a word by way of a remark to this statement? So, I mean, I certainly agree that the language of Yevdokia is used in patristic sources in reference to the relationship between the Father and the Son. I think in most cases it would still be used for the economy of the Son and for Father's relation to the economy of the Son as distinct from the intertrinitarian relations. But it seems to me that a lot of philosophical work will have to be done before the claim that somehow the act of nature is equivalent to the act of goodwill. Because after all, that's what Yevdokia means. I mean, so the introduction of a new technical term doesn't really explain much for me in this case, whereas it's just that this really requires a lot of philosophical unpacking before this could be made coherent. And so I don't see any obvious way out of the impasse of, well, again, first of all, trying to understand precisely what is the distinction between the act of will and the act of nature or the act of essence. Incidentally, you would not find, it is the case that this is quintessentially Florovsky's distinction, and this is how he interprets Athanasius, that is true. But you will not find in Athanasius the exact formulation, the act of essence, for example, okay? You will find something like energeia thesousias, but you will not actually find anything amounting to what Florovsky claims here as a distinction. Now, this might be simply a verbal quibble, but it's not, I think, immaterial completely to the issue.
Thank you. I think, Mr. Chairman, you will allow me to make a comment on creatio ex nihilo, because it's important discussion in the cosmological context. Because I think that the difficulty with all debates on creatio ex nihilo can be classified in 3 points. The first point, if I take a philosophical language, creatio ex nihilo is discussed in the so-called natural attitude. Natural attitude from a phenomenological point of view, when you try to look at this creatio ex nihilo as an object. And this is absolute false statement, because creatio ex nihilo is not an object. It's a condition for the existence of objects. It's a transcendental condition for the cognition of the world. In this sense, to position creatio ex nihilo in the way whether it has boundary between created and uncreated, it's similar to, you said, you quoted Athanasius, but I can quote the Archytas of Tarant, long before, who was a Pythagorean, and he was trying to actually go through the world by a stick and asking the question, what is beyond the world? But this is a fundamental fallacy, because creatio ex nihilo is not an object. It's a condition for objectivity. From a philosophical point of view, it's a condition of existence. So that's why when you ask about the boundary of creatio ex nihilo, it's just asking question about what is the boundary of condition of existence. But within existence, you cannot answer this question. So that's why definitely this approach is futile outright. And this is a problem of all cosmologists who are trying to model creatio ex nihilo, because they're trying to model as a transition from something, as you rightly said, pre-existence, existent. But the pre-existent itself is already in existence. So that's why we cannot model in logical terms actually creatio ex nihilo. This is a problem. So that's why the only possible stance from a philosophical point of view, which was understood in the 20th century, is a phenomenological stance, saying that creatio ex nihilo is a condition of subjectivity. You articulate the world in the condition of subjectivity, which is created. Now, in theological sense, what language can we use in order to express this? Because the language of logi, or the language of energies, is a possible language. But I tell you that in 2007, I talked with Metropolitan John at the Ecological Conference in London, and we came to the conclusion that, in fact, if you develop the notion of hypostasis, divine hypostasis, personhood, and if you realize that the world is made in the hypostasis of the Logos, then unhypostasization, if I use the language of the Leontius of Byzantium, will be enough in order to express only one fact, that the world does not exist independently. So creatio ex nihilo, it's statement that the world does not exist independently, it subsists in the hypostasis of the Logos. But in this sense, we can easily, if we take this language, avoid all intermediate agencies, like, let's say, even logi and even energies, because we just state that the world is not existent independently. Now, me, as a human being, I am not existing independently because I was born without my will. I do not control the fact of my existence. So that's why I am a little model of the universe, because I am subsisting in the Logos of Creator. Correspondingly, the last question. But how to deal with this? I mean, because your question, Paul, was very simple, how to make a constructive, actually, analogy in order to explicate creatio. In the ambiguous 7, St. Maximus says that the analogy is very simple, that we are, if we imitate the image of the divine, we know the world, not by means of simple knowledge, understanding, reason, but we know the world by means of the will. Now, what does it mean to know the world by means of the will? According to Maximus, it means that we don't want to be circumscribed by the necessities of nature. We want to change nature. We want to accept this nature as a blatant, I would say, fact. We want to change it. How we will change nature? It's very simple. All scientific progress, all technical progress tells you that we are changing nature. Our will isn't changing nature. Our will is creating the atomic bomb. And our will is whether to actually make explosion and to kill many people or not. This is a result of our will, because in spite of the fact that we are using the elements of nature, which are chaotically dispersed in the universe, it's our will to change this nature.
And that's why this analogy, if you indeed believe in the divine image in us, gives us the chance to understand what does it mean to create the world by means of will. Because the question was, what does it mean to create the world by means of will? And my answer is very simple. If we are made in the image of God with a free will, with a freedom, and if we are capable of changing some parameters of this world by means of our will, what does it mean? Volitional decision of changing the world, changing the atmosphere, changing the structure of this planet, then we can extend this analogy toward theology. Yes, to create the world by means of will, it means to articulate the world, to make this world in the particular conditions which are accessible to our knowledge. But once again, creatio ex nihilo, it's not an object, it's not an objective process. It's a condition for knowledge, it's a condition for understanding, it's a condition for our application of our will. And that's why all object-like, non-phenomenological approach to creatio ex nihilo is futile by definition, it's dead. And it was understood by phenomenologists. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to comment?
Well, this takes us so far off the field that I'm not sure that it actually warrants a comment. I mean, I certainly could say that just as a matter of historical fact, the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo emerges at some point in mid-2nd century in some undifferentiated form. You have it in Philo, but the primary issue, of course, is either averting the concern that the world is here by chance, or averting a concern that it's fashioned out of pre-existing matter, or averting the typical sort of Gnostic deliberations on the matter. And of course it arises in the Church's reflection on the Second Maccabees, 728, and then in the discussion of certain Johannine texts and Pauline texts.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that calling God the Creator was the one way the Hebrews distinguished their God from all other gods. So one of the ways that St. Paul confesses the divinity of Christ as he relates him to the act of creating and sustaining the universe. That's all I'll say.
Another question here.
To this very rich discussion, I would like to add another element, the relation of nous and logos, which is intellect and reason, so to speak. And I think that we have some sort of orthodox construction in the 20th century that Oriental theology has only an ontological Trinitary theology, while the West has also a psychological one. Whereas I think that in Maximus we could find a sort of psychological Trinitary theology based on the concepts of nous, logos, and pneuma, which is not only a simple allegory. I think that in the concept of nous, or intellect, we find a kind of simplicity, a nuclear simplicity, which is expressed by the logos, which at the same time reason and speech. And also in the pneuma, I also have spirit and breath. So the crucial thing I think about the relation of Maximian Trinitary theology and theology of creation is that the Son is the avtourgos of the creation, the one who is, so to speak, the proper author of creation. This could be interpreted that it happens because of the incarnation, because he's the only one to become history, to be part of history. But I think that in Maximus' spirit, it is also the opposite. It is that in the Trinity, the Son is the Logos, which means an expression of the divine simplicity of the nous. So as he is the Logos, he is also the one to do the avturgia both by the creation and by the incarnation. And we can find an analogy with human psychology, where nous is some sort of a simple nucleus, where you can find also the affexusion, for example, or a pure prayer, and logos is the expression of it, and also there is pneuma. So I think we should have in mind this sort of dialogue between nous and logos. And secondly, which is also a question, I wonder, I think that at some time in the 20th century, we made more a theology of contingency, And I wonder if this has started with Florovsky or after Florovsky, because I think that this difference between nature and will that we find in Athanasius was at some time interpreted like in terms of contingency, in a sort that nature means that God determines his own being by being a father, while will means something that is outside of God as a contingent being. So I wonder if this shift is done by Florovsky or afterwards.
The first point was, I take it, was a comment. And so the question is precisely who is the first to introduce the notion of contingency. I mean, it's certainly, it's a kind of fundamental, if you will, patristic notion, and it exists already in, significantly, sort of philosophically differentiated form, shall we say, from the 2nd century on. You find, of course, a lot of discussion of it and reflection on it in the scholastics. So certainly Florovsky was not the discoverer of contingency. However, it is the case that some modern Orthodox discussions are couched in such a way that somehow Florovsky's article on creation sort of opens up a new territory, whereas in reality what you have here is primarily a very clever, if you will, polemical sort of move against precisely Bulgakov's sociology.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Florovsky has integrated the Western concept into Orthodox theology. I would like to point out that because we don't have, I think that we don't have such a specific term like contingency in Orthodox, in Oriental Hellenic theology. We have concepts like will, for example. We don't have such a specific concept like contingency. So I wonder if there was an integration of some Western concept in Orthodox theology.
Do you want to spring to action? Because that arises a beast in me. So I really don't, because I mean there is a basically the concept of contingency is neither Eastern nor Western nor Southern nor Northern nor Hawaiian. And I think in general, doing your theology by geography is just not advised. And I think, hopefully in the 21st century, we can grow out of the situation where calling something Western essentially somehow precludes any serious rational discussion of the matter. I take it that you want to engage in the rational discussion of the matter, and so in that regard, obviously, there is a sense in which, to the extent to which contingency involves dependence on God and involves temporality, essentially, of the world, however that's precisely conceived. The crucial issue is this. Florovsky believes that the concept of emerging eternity, something becoming eternity, that's the exact phrase, is a cogent notion. In other words, that something that is contingent and temporal can subsequently exist in God as eternal by grace, essentially. Florovsky believes that that's a cogent position. Bulgakov doesn't. Bulgakov doesn't believe that you can be initiated into eternity, but somehow, in other words, the notion of eternity that has a beginning, if you will, doesn't strike Bulgakov as cogent. So that's really where the debate is within that particular sort of discussion. But again, a broader issue here, it seems to me, is that a concept P is Western. Therefore, what? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Right. Well, yeah.
Yes.
Just to continue this, one comment. I don't think that Father Florovsky used that much contingent, but afterwards Thomas Torrance, who was in contact with Florovsky, really started using the term very intensively. So if you want to see a link, you should look at Thomas Torrance about specifically the terminology of contingency. Yeah, but my question is one comment and one question to Paul. So you presented the difference between Florovsky and Bulgakov within the difference between this balance, between the balance between ontological difference and divine human communion. In Bulgakov's case, you see this as being on the side of the on the divine human communion, and on the Florovsky's case, you see it as more on the ontological difference.
To the extent to which Florovsky doesn't have any account of communicatio idiomatum. Yes.
Yeah. So in here, I would like to see this in a different way in the role of human freedom, and in this sense, I would say that I would see it not as a difference in the emphasis on divine human communion. It's more about the nature of this divine human communion. And in Florovsky's case, it is like an invitation. It's an achievement that needs to be fulfilled willingly. And in Bulgakov's case, it seems to be a predefined in a way. And this is what was one of the critiques of Zenkovsky, for example, to Bulgakov, who was saying that in the way he sees the world, it will appear that evil has no reason. But this is just a comment, and you can comment on it. But my real question is, so you didn't mention one thing that they talk both about, and this is the incarnation with independent of the fall. In relation to Saint Maximus, they both spoke about this, and you didn't cover this. What would you say about that?
Well, it seems to me that discussion in Bulgakov precedes the discussion in Florovsky. It's remarkable, actually, that Florovsky entertains that particular speculation, given the general tenor of his theology. He should stay away from the claim that without the fall there would still be incarnation, because after all, the claim is not based on anything historical. And since everything since the knowledge of God derives from one source and one source only, and that is divine revelation mediated through quote-unquote ecclesial experience, historical divine revelation. He was really into the acts of God sort of theology of the 50s and 60s, although very rarely quotes it. Because of that, it seems to me that it's not something that you can sort of fit into his corpus into a cogent way. But at the same time, this is certainly a wonderful theologumenon that forms a kind of a common platform between Maximus, Florovsky, and Bulgakov. So you're absolutely right on that front. Yes.
Can I ask a question? And make a comment too? Kalenik, I liked your discussion of Staniloi's doctrine of the Logi. This kind of reminds me of Andrew Louth's paper at the Oxford Conference in 2007, when we had a special session on Ambiguum 7. And his paper raised the question as to whether we get, when we talk about the Logi doctrine in Maximus, we get too caught up in the sort of ontological distinctions, that we lose sight of the sort of the original sense of the Logos. And to me, I feel like Staniloi is trying to recapture to some degree Maximus's own sense that the Logi are sort of the means through which God pre-evangelizes the creation, in a sense. And that we immediately sort of then get caught in this fray of trying to determine their exact ontological status and so forth and so on. Do you think that's kind of what... Do you see Staniloi as maybe trying to retrieve... Because you say, that for him there's this sort of...
Unquestionably.
Ontological and existential dimension sort of wrapped up.
I'll just comment briefly about that. In St. Maximus the Confessor, the logoi are also called the thelemata, the wills,
right,
which would relate it in a way to a personal act. And so, to give a simple example, anybody who is a Christian, or let's just be extreme and say is not a Christian, you see the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, there's something that puts your soul into awe. In other words, the beauty of creation witnesses to, well, what we would say its sanctity. So for Stenolaya, if you took an example of a simple tree, you would say this tree has a logos in God. But when I look at the tree and its beauty warms my heart, I say, wondrous are thy works, O Lord. Or if it's a tree I grew up with, maybe I'm visiting the tree for the first time in 20 years and I remember that I spoke to my grandfather there, or that I had a picnic there with my siblings. So in human language, we would say this tree has sentimental value. But in theological terms, we would say that the tree has an iconic value. It has a transparency. We look at the tree and we look through it to something else. Well, to continue the analogy, that is, if we saw the whole world in this context, God is communicating through us. We look through the tree to Him. The tree is just a step, but the only way we do that is through asceticism, through not being attached to one aspect of a thing through passion, seeing its deeper meaning and not just its meaning for me. Then we begin to understand what the contemplation of nature is.
But what would be the contemplation of a magnificent sunset through what Maximus requires to be viewing all things through the lens of the cross and the resurrection?
Well, I suppose we could use another simple analogy. I don't want to try people's patience. But take the example of a human thing like wine. If I sat down with you and poured myself a glass of wine and drank it, that would be rude. The purpose of wine is to share it, to have an event of communion between us. A passionate man is attached only to the fact that he will be intoxicated. He'll give you lousy wine, keep the good wine for himself. But wine, an aspect of creation, is meant for communion. We do that by giving, by an ascetic restraint. And then, ultimately it's consecrated. In our wine, it becomes something totally other in the Eucharist, a complete window to God. Well, all creation should be seen in this way of cross, of self-denial, and resurrection, of seeing it towards communion with the Logos.
And that's one of Stenolai's most magnificent.
Stenolai he makes these comments, these types of analogies constantly in his commentary on St. Maximus.
Yeah. The reference to, chapters on knowledge 167, I think, where he says, right after having said, we contemplate the Logi through the cross and the resurrection, he says, everything has to have a cross.
The world is imprinted on the entire world.
Cross. Right. Beautiful. We still have just a few minutes, about 5 more minutes.
So there is a sense, and I think actually this is a point, the notion of seeing expressions of divine wisdom, divine order in the world. Obviously, you could get to that notion through simply natural theology. That is to say, you contemplate the order of the universe by a relevant set of deductive arguments, you get to something like the existence of God. It's clear that Maximus's thought is not focused on that type of suggestion, but rather precisely it's sort of perception-like. It's perception-like a recognition of the presence of certain attributes, features of God. And it's because it's perception-like, perception itself requires a training. And so in the collection that I recently co-edited with Sarah Coakley, there is actually a chapter on Maximus written, the collection is entitled The Spiritual Senses, Perceiving God in Western Christianity. And there's a chapter on Maximus in that collection, and the argument of the chapter is that spiritual perception precisely requires moral training and training in virtue. So spiritual perception requires a kind of an integration of the self, in which the will, intention, and essentially and all, if you will, moral makeup of the person participates in the act of perception. I don't have to be virtuous to see there is a bottle in front of me, but in fact there is a sense in which I have to train my perception so that by the grace of God I could then see God's presence in creation.
time for maybe one more question? Anyone? Well, if not, then we'll break a few minutes early. Thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers. Very good.
Thank you on our behalf as well for wonderful presentations. A few announcements, dear guests and dear participants. First of all, the bus and the van will be departing at 6 o'clock, taking us to the University Hall, where we have the conclusion of our symposium. The other thing is that from the University Hall, we will be going to the restaurant Ada on Danube River for dinner at 9 o'clock. Everybody is invited, especially the participants, the registered guests, and translators, personnel, and staff. Tomorrow, we will be departing by 7:15 a.m. in the morning, of course, from the hotel. And then we will go to the Hotel Slavia to pick up other guests so that we can be in Kostolac for the liturgy by 9:15. We're inviting you all to submit your papers for publication that will be finished, we believe, very soon. But if you agree, that could be by the end of November or December, whatever you decide. But let's say that by the end of this year. Thanks to those of you who were kind enough to bring with them the books to enrich our library. Very precious gifts. And that would be all for now. Pozivamo vas sve da nam se sada pridružite. Odlazi autobus i odlazi kombi fakultetski prema univerzitetsku, to jest rektoratu. Svečana sala u rektorata, je li tako? Gdje će biti 2 posljednja predavanja. A posle toga pozvani ste na večeru u restoran Ada. Autobus će nas prevesti, trebalo bi da krenemo, dakle, odmah posle predavanja. Tamo ćemo vidjeti na kom mjestu će biti prevozna sredstva. A sutra je polazak u 7:15 ispred hotela Nevski, a u 7:30 ispred Slavije. I odlazimo na liturgiju u grad Kostolac, na osvećenje crkve posvećene Svetom Maksimu. Hvala vam još jednom svima. I was told that the glue adhesive quality was very high, but as they say, don't trust a skinny cook. Now we can say that we shouldn't trust the adhesive sellers at all. Thank you all i živjeli prijatno veče i nastavljamo sa programom.